Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Current Issues in Animal Law lecture series brought to you by Vermont Law School and the Environmental Law Center. I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm the director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental Programs at VLS. Today, there will be time for questions and answers after the presentation. So please type any questions you have in the chat box, and you can do that at any point during the lecture, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in the remaining time. Today, we are very pleased to welcome Laura Fox. Laura joined the Humane Society of the United States Animal Protection Law Department in 2015 as an attorney focusing on issues related to puppy mills, and now is the staff attorney for Farm Animal Protection based in Washington, D.C. Laura works to protect farm animals from the industrialized practices of factory farms, including by reducing extreme confinement practices and challenging their environmental impacts. A large aspect of Laura's work is spent filing complaints with federal and state agencies and litigating issues arising under the National Environmental Policy Act, the Administrative Procedure Act, the Freedom of Information Act, and other federal statutes, as well as litigating consumer protection cases at the state level. Laura is an adjunct professor of animal law at George Mason's Law School and an alumni of Vermont Law School with a JD and a Master of Environmental Law and Policy, and she also holds a Master's in Philosophy from George Mason. Today, her talk is entitled Environmental Public Health and Other Societal Harms of Extreme Farmed Animal Confinement. Please join me in welcoming Laura Fox.
Thank you so much, Jenny, and thanks everyone for joining me today. I'm going to try and share some slides with you now, so bear with me 1 second. All right, so there have been so many recent developments in farmed animal law that I want to talk to you about. And this is especially given the growing recognition that animal welfare and human welfare are essentially entwined. I'm going to touch on as many issues as possible over the next 40 minutes or so, and then open it up to questions. I'd like to start with a recent historic decision arising out of a farmed animal nuisance action. To me, this opinion signals a tipping point that society at large is finally fed up with our deplorable treatment of farmed animals and will stop ignoring the burdens industrialized animal agriculture disproportionately places on marginalized communities. I also hope that it's a signal that transformational change in this sector is imminent. The matter is McIver v. Murphy Brown, a Smithfield subsidiary. Smithfield is the largest pork producer in the world. The case involves a nearly 15,000 pig CAFO, or concentrated animal feeding operation, that generated over 150,000 pounds of waste every day, which, as you can imagine, caused many problems for surrounding neighbors. These neighbors sued the company for nuisance, a tort action used to address injuries caused by unreasonable interference with the use and enjoyment of one's property. Smithfield lost at trial and appealed the verdict to the Fourth Circuit. It is here we get a remarkable concurrence by Judge Wilkinson, a very influential conservative judge on the court. Judge Wilkinson's brilliant concurrence perfectly weaves the myriad environmental, animal welfare, and societal harms of factory farming into a cohesive narrative. He wrote what so many advocates have been preaching for decades, that factory farming is not just an issue of animal welfare or rights. It is not just a problem that should only concern those who care about the treatment of animals. It is an issue of environmental justice, workers' rights, and public health. So I wholeheartedly agree with Judge Wilkinson that it is past time to acknowledge the full harms of the unreformed practices of factory farming are afflicting. And I may add, while I know it's much easier said than done, it's past time for activist groups, environmental, animal, social justice, workers' rights, public health, and others to form stronger alliances to collaborate on common goals and tackle these harms. In the words of Judge Wilkinson, and you'll see that this is a theme throughout, treating animals better will benefit humans. Our collective welfare is intricately connected. Taking a look first at issues of animal welfare, intensive confinement and overcrowded conditions frustrate, distress, and cause suffering to animals. Many animals even die due to complications from their overcrowded environments. There is extensive scientific evidence showing that intensively confined farmed animals suffer because they are unable to exercise, fully extend their limbs, or engage in important natural behaviors. A federal advisory board noted that good animal welfare requires that animals be able to perform species-specific behaviors, and since intensive confinement interferes with the natural behaviors, is detrimental to the animal's well-being. The harms to animals are interconnected with harms to farm workers and community members. For example, it is well established that close confinement of animals leads to the increased risk of disease transmission. In part, this is because of if one animal becomes infected, her close proximity to other animals can intensify the rapid spread of the virus from one animal to another. And with each transfer, the virus has the potential to mutate into something novel and even more deadly. This is like playing virus roulette. Those working in or living near factory farms are at the highest risk of exposure to potential zoonotic diseases, those that can be transmitted from animal to human. But as we all know, viruses can spread rapidly and create a global problem. Thus, intensive confinement is extremely problematic from both an animal welfare and public health standpoint. The vast majority of new diseases that have emerged in humans over recent decades are of animal origin. These zoonotic diseases are usually directly related to the human consumption of animal-sourced food, be it from wildlife or farmed animals. Animals concentrated in large numbers and in tight environments at CAFOs create a breeding ground for disease. Packing several animals into a crate or a cage provides limited movement and no opportunity for social distancing, which works for animals like it does for humans in slowing down the spread of infectious disease. Crates and cages create even more of a problem because they are harder to disinfect. It's not always possible to clean every joint or nook of the cages, so when new animals are put into the cages, the infection can begin again. But even without cages, high stocking densities amplify pandemic risks. Stocking density is the number of animals that are kept on a given unit of area. For example, it is common industry practice to give broiler chickens, those raised for their meat, less than 1 square foot of space per bird, which gives them about the size of a typical sheet of paper to live on, which, like with cage systems, provides little to no opportunity for them to spread out. The United Nations has pointed out that due to the growth in industrialized farming of animals, there has never before been as many opportunities for pathogens to pass through animals and the environment to affect humans. The risk of viral disease from intensively confined farm animals is an existential threat. Sorry, I know we don't need another one to worry about, but this is a central issue in one of HSUS's lawsuits against USDA, which challenges the federal government's response plan to outbreaks of avian influenza. Avian influenza is commonly known as bird flu, or you may have heard of specific strands such as H5N1 or H2N2. Avian influenza is categorized based on its virulence to chickens as either low pathogenic or high pathogenic. So you also may have heard the virus referred to as LPAI or HPAI. Bird flu is a viral respiratory disease that infects all avian species and can also infect pigs and humans, so it has zoonotic potential. It is a common disease in birds, but it frequently changes. This makes it very dangerous because with each mutation, there is a chance that it will become more severe. Again, we're playing virus roulette. HPAI is a potentially fatal virus to humans and has a mortality rate much higher than many other infectious diseases, including COVID-19. When people have become infected with bird flu, the mortality rate is about 60%, which is pretty terrifying. Obviously, as made extremely apparent by the current COVID-19 crisis, it is of paramount importance to mitigate and control novel disease outbreaks. Given these risks, there must be federal laws that strictly regulate these practices, right? Wrong. There are no federal laws that regulate the treatment of animals on the farm, as distinct from during transport or at slaughter facilities. So our lawsuit seeks to find another way to get the federal government to incentivize safer and more humane practices. As it stands, USDA's HPAI plan does nothing to disincentivize dangerous, high-density animal operations, which not only wreak havoc on the environment through air, water, and other pollution, but also heightens pandemic risks. When an outbreak occurs at large facilities that use dangerous and extreme confinement practices, and USDA kills the farmed animals to control the spread, the government pays those producers to restock the cages or fill warehouses at the same density. This is like building a house on a cliff in a hurricane belt, and each time it crumbles or falls over the edge, the government gives you money to rebuild in the same spot. HSUS has proposed an alternative plan that would have USDA condition indemnification on placing animals raised for food or to produce eggs in cage-free, low-density environments. Not only would this improve the conditions for the millions of farmed animals currently raised in extreme confinement, raising animals in a safer and more diffuse environment would also slow the mutation and spread of disease. Disincentivizing extreme confinement practices through indemnification procedures is a viable, reasonable alternative that would diminish much of the industry's environmental impacts, reduce animal suffering, and help prevent future outbreaks. As the UN recognizes, outbreak prevention is more humane, safer, and cheaper than waiting to respond to an outbreak. For now, though, according to the plan, when an infected flock or herd is detected, USDA's plan requires animals to be killed, or as the government euphemistically calls it, depopulated. The approved methods of killing are yet another area of concern. Ventilation shutdown is probably the most inhumane depopulation method. It involves shutting down a facility's entire ventilation system, including those huge fans you can see in this photo that are used generally to regulate temperature and filter debris. But turning them off causes a buildup in the facility of carbon dioxide and heat that suffocates the birds, essentially cooking conscious birds to a protracted and unnecessarily torturous death. Another depopulation method is the application of water-based foam, which, as you can see from the picture on the slide, is used to cover birds, and the foam slowly expands and suffocates them. This is a slightly better option than VSD, but this method still causes birds to suffocate while conscious, which is still agonizing and slow death. There are many other methods of killing, such as poisoning, decapitation, and captive bolt gun. But since many of those methods require individual handling, they are not seen as practical for use on large flocks or herds in an emergency. The more humane depopulation method that could be deployed quickly in an emergency, but unfortunately is not yet commonly used in the United States, is the application of fast expanding nitrogen-filled foam. This is a more humane alternative method because unlike water-based foam, the gases in this foam render birds unconscious before they suffocate. While we don't want any animal to be depopulated in this or any manner, the existential threat of a global HPAI pandemic could require this extreme action, as we have seen the devastating effects a pandemic can cause. But again, the alternative plan HSU has proposed to stop subsidizing dangerous practices should help reduce the risk of infection and thus reduce the need for such destructive measures. While the depopulation methods like spray foam and VSD were contemplated to be used during emergencies, when there's actually a real threat of public health and safety, the industry has decided to deploy these emergency measures to kill flocks and herds because there is a backup at slaughterhouses. To them, it's too expensive to maintain the animals at farms, while slaughterhouses around the country shut or slow down due to COVID outbreaks among workers. So for no other reason but for the bottom line, millions of healthy animals are being killed on the farm where there is no oversight in torturous ways. Thousands of veterinary professionals and advocates, including the Humane Society Veterinary Medical Association, sent a petition to the American Veterinary Medical Association, or AVMA, asking the organization to reclassify ventilation shutdown in all its forms as not recommended, making it clear that this inhumane practice is not acceptable in virtually any circumstances, especially non-emergency situations. While the AVMA is a non-governmental institution, USDA generally defers to them when establishing best practices and approved methods. So changes to the AVMA guidance would have real impacts. The use of torturous killing methods, of course, manifests first in animal suffering, but they also impose harms to farm workers who have to deploy the methods and the community at large who deal with the waste and environmental pollution of decomposing bodies. The unnecessary and cruel use of depopulation methods on healthy herds and flocks is a consequence of shutting and slowing down slaughterhouses due to workers getting and dying from COVID. Coronavirus outbreaks at meatpacking plants nationwide have resulted in the deaths of more than 250 employees. As such, workers on the farm aren't the only employees who suffer from industrialized animal agriculture. Slaughterhouse workers have always had one of the most dangerous jobs with high rates of injury, dismemberment, and death. And the dangers of these jobs have been exacerbated by the current crisis. It's looking possible that with the change in administration and leadership, these workers will soon get the protections they so desperately need. The systemic worker safety issues of big animal agriculture go way beyond the recent COVID outbreak, though. As I mentioned, working in a slaughterhouse just in general is risky. Yet worker safety is being jeopardized even more by increased line speeds at slaughterhouses. The slaughter line is the conveyor belt-like system on which animals are hung to move through the slaughter process. Workers manually pick up animals and shackle them by their legs and upside down to those lines. At 140 birds per minute, the line speed at poultry plants was already way too fast. But at many plants, the speed was increased to 175 birds per minute. Let that sink in for a second. Every minute, workers are shackling 175 birds to a single slaughter line to be killed. At pork processing plants, the increase went from just over 1,100 pigs per hour to being limitless, even though faster lines result in increased food safety and humane handling violations. Increasing line speed also pose worker safety issues. In today's COVID world, increasing line speed means more workers on the line or workers moving more rapidly, which reduces their ability to distance themselves, putting them at greater risk of becoming infected. And then at all times, workers struggling to keep up with fast-moving lines are at heightened risk of work-related injuries like wrist and finger sprains or breaks and carpal tunnel. Again, the issues of human and animal welfare are intricately linked. Fortunately, the plan to increase line speed at poultry plants was recently withdrawn, but dozens of plants are already operating under waivers allowing them to process 175 birds per minute, and there is yet to be a reversal on pig line speed increases. So for the sake of the animals, workers, and food safety, USDA should revoke those waivers and reverse course on eliminating maximum line speeds for pigs. Slaughterhouse and farm workers risk their lives to keep up with our demand for meat. Probably not surprisingly, given our society's failures around equity and justice, these workers are often from disenfranchised groups. Many are immigrants, BIPOC, or otherwise marginalized. Similarly, those who live in the communities surrounding these operations are also often oppressed. These community members suffer many discrete and pervasive harms, from air and water pollution to noise, odor, and aesthetic harms, to decreased property values and diminished ability to use outdoor space or recreate safely. In Judge Wilkinson's view, these harms are well established almost to the point of judicial notice to be visited disproportionately upon the dispossessed, here on minority populations and poor communities. The hugely unacceptable truth that Judge Wilkinson so aptly observes is that these harms would not have been tolerated for as long as they have been had the surrounding community been wealthier or more politically powerful. Fortunately for the neighbors of the farms at issue in these nuisance cases, the court understood that our longstanding tort traditions are designed to protect not just the rich, but everyone, especially from unreasonable, willful, and wanton conduct like that of Smithfield, which had such obvious negative impacts. But this result has been a long time coming, a result that was built upon many other communities that have suffered and continue to disproportionately bear the harms of big agribusinesses like Smithfield that have for so long operated with impunity. Another beacon of hope exists with the recent appointment of VLS's own Marian Engelman Lotto. Together with all the great work of so many advocates, we should start seeing real progress made on the environmental justice front. As Marian was reported to have said, Biden is the first president that has really committed their platform to addressing issues of inequality in the environmental sector, and this is the moment to bring higher visibility to those who have been negatively impacted by environmental injustices. This is also an area the Humane Society and our partner groups are trying to address in the bird flu case against USDA we just discussed, and is an issue to keep an eye out for when reviewing for deficiencies in federal rulemakings. A standing executive order requires agencies to examine whether there are disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, policies, and activities on minority populations and low-income populations. Unfortunately, when developing its HPAI response plan, USDA failed to evaluate its environmental justice issues. First, the agency claimed that there was no way of determining the effects in advance, but then concluded that its plan poses no disproportionate adverse effects to minority and low-income populations. This is entirely illogical and legally inadequate, especially when the agency knows full well of the correlation between race, income, and exposure to hazardous waste disposal, animal carcasses included. As Judge Wilkinson put it, the connection is well established, almost to the point of judicial notice. Quoting from Judge Wilkinson again, "For the animal's sake and for ours, we should take efforts to make farm animal lives less intolerable." Unfortunately, not everyone has the same sensibilities as Judge Wilkinson. While the Smithfield nuisance cases were being litigated, the North Carolina legislature amended its Right to Farm Act, limiting what remedies are available for nuisance actions to the loss of property value, meaning plaintiffs could no longer recover for damages related to their suffering, annoyance, and loss of enjoyment. This change heavily stymies action and strips away longstanding property rights that and protections of many already disenfranchised people. However, all is not lost. Following the successful series of nuisance cases, a new suit was filed by other aggrieved neighbors of similar CAFOs, this time bringing in additional causes of action, including trespass, negligence, and unjust enrichment. Unsurprisingly, Smithfield argued that each of these actions is barred by North Carolina's Right to Farm Act. Fortunately, the district court recognized that negligence, trespass, and nuisance are distinct causes of action that should be considered on their own individual merits, and so declined to dismiss the case. Unfortunately, we've seen this approach go sideways in other jurisdictions. Courts in Indiana have found contrarily that its Right to Farm Act, which specifically and only references nuisance, also provides protections against negligence and trespass claims that are perceived to be repackaged nuisance claims. Legislative backlash is always a possible unintended consequence to consider when pursuing any strategic litigation. Here we have newly proposed legislation that appears to be in response to the successful and new actions in North Carolina. It extends Florida's Right to Farm Act to protect farms against not only nuisance, negligence, and trespass, but also claims of personal injury, strict liability, and other torts. There are some caveats that at first glance appear to provide some balance, like excluding conduct that does not comply with state and federal environmental laws. But federal environmental laws are insufficient and have been weakened even further over the past 4 years. For instance, under EPA guidance, albeit unlawful guidance, CAFOs are no longer required to report harmful emissions under the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA. And the EPA hasn't updated slaughterhouse effluent wastewater limitations, even though it should have pursuant to the Clean Water Act. Now, maybe these limitations and laws will change under this new administration or in response to our lawsuits. But even if those laws were applied to industrial ag operations to their fullest extent, there would still be many operations that are below the threshold that trigger these laws, but still create nuisance for neighbors. State laws do very little to fill in the gaps. So that safeguard is also pretty meaningless. These environmental laws were simply not meant to address the same harms as the centuries-old tort causes of nuisance, trespass, or negligence. We should be on the lookout for similar bills to be introduced in other jurisdictions, though. Fortunately, not all the indirect impacts of the successful nuisance cases have been negative. There are also sometimes unintended upshots to the cases that we bring. One potential positive outcome has been the growing number of insurers who are unwilling to cover many of the harmful activities of industrialized farming. Building upon the finding that Smithfield's behavior was willful and wanton, its insurers are arguing Smithfield was fully aware of the harms its practices would cause, and therefore it's not required to provide insurance coverage. Indeed, these nuisance lawsuits show that there was nothing accidental about the harms to neighbors caused by Smithfield's hog operations, and that Smithfield knew about the deleterious effects of its farming practices. This awareness, however, did not stop Smithfield from suing another one of its insurers in a prior action to force it to cover the same kind of dangerous deeds. In that case, Smithfield sued its insurer, claiming that it was obligated to cover the defense costs in the series of nuisance lawsuits, including the McIver matter. The insurance company, of course, denied this coverage. Eventually, Smithfield and the insurer came to some kind of resolution regarding the insurer's duty to defend, and a consent motion to dismiss on the duty to defend claim was filed and granted. We don't, know for certain what prompted the dismissal of that claim, likely some form of settlement that provided some coverage. But the positive trend we're seeing is that insurers are increasingly refusing to pay for the known harmful and dangerous practices of industrialized ag. I propose that the clear public health risks related to extreme animal confinement and other related harmful practices of big ag is perhaps another area insurers will focus on and increasingly decline to cover, or at least increase premiums for. The risk of zoonosis from factory farms is like the risk of forest fires from power lines. As the risks become more apparent and substantiated, insurers may have an incentive to condition coverage on less risky practices like lower stocking density and cage and crate-free operations. This is an area we're likely to see some additional developments in. Finally, I want to take a minute to note the influence amici can have on a court. You may have noticed in the cited portions of Judge Wilkinson's concurrence references to the amicus brief submitted by HSUS. Friends of the court or amici can emphasize favorable facts and circumstances, add to arguments, and provide different, possibly unrepresented perspectives. But there are many considerations to think about when deciding whether to submit an amicus brief. There are obvious considerations like whether you have the bandwidth and resources to put it together, what stage the case is at, and whether now is the best time to get involved. Would the case precedent impact your advocacy mission or members? It's important to assess whether the case presents an important issue that will have broader importance beyond its impacts to the parties. But even if the outcome wouldn't make much of a difference, if submitting an amicus brief gives you the opportunity to get your narrative before the court and possibly the public via press coverage, it may still be worth the effort. An amicus brief can at times be a great marketing tool. However, you also want to make sure that you'd be adding important context for the court that won't be covered by the parties or other amici. You will, for sure, always want to be careful not to duplicate efforts or reading for the court. So then there are other strategic considerations like whether the opposition utilized amici and your brief is necessary to provide a counter argument or perspective. You might also look into how your organization or particular mission is generally perceived in the jurisdiction. If you think there's a tinge of animosity towards your organization or mission among the court, and if you can't get a grasp on the court's views, you can look to how the community and the districts view your organization. So if it's not favorable, your involvement may be more harmful than helpful. You're also better off not submitting an amicus brief if your brief presents unsupported or easily rebutted facts or replies, or it relies on untested science or data. Submitting an amicus brief like this might impact a party's credibility, or even worse, undermine the party and cause the court to assume the opposite set of facts or data. You don't always know whether your amicus brief is actually going to be read by the court rather than its clerks. But when your brief is cited at oral argument or in the opinion, you know it played a role, at least some role. So I'm thrilled that our brief played a small role in Judge Wilkinson's remarkable, well-crafted concurrence, which gives me hope for the future well-being of farmed animals and society alike. Thank you for bearing with me through all of that. I'm now happy to open it up to questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that interesting talk. Well, given that we are at Vermont Law School and you have a master's degree in environmental law and policy, which is so core to VLS's mission, it has long been the case that there's been kind of a disconnect between animal rights law and the animal rights community and the environmental community and environmental advocates. And it seems as though that has changed a bit more recently, but I wonder what you could say to the environmental lawyers listening to this talk about what is the role of animal rights and animal treatment in environmental law and vice versa.
Yeah, that's such a great question. When I was at VLS, and a member of the Animal Law Society, there was a bit of animosity towards our group and perspective, and it was not always welcome, our input, when it came to traditional environmental legal issues. But I do agree with you that I think it's starting to change. People are acknowledging and realizing, I think, the connection between animal welfare and human welfare, and including, right, our environmental interests. And so I think that that's a positive growth that's occurring, and I hope continues to occur, and that we're able to, build coalitions, to work together, to make impacts that not only make environmental changes, but also improve lives for animals. So they're not mutually exclusive interests, right? That's like my whole kind of presentation theme was about. They're all interconnected and overlapping. And so if we can work together, I think we can make much bigger changes that are necessary to save our environment. I'm sorry, I can't hear you any longer.
There I am. Sorry.
Okay.
So related to that, what advice would you have for students who are graduating law school now and are really passionate about animal law? You've worked at some organizations that I think are really exciting to some of our new graduates. So what advice would you have for them heading off into their careers?
Yeah. Okay. So if you went to law school like me, knowing that you wanted to do animal law, it really is about networking and timing. So I would suggest taking every opportunity that you can to pursue internships, and reach out and get mentors from people who work at the organizations that you want to work in. And then, right, once you've identified the area within animal law that you want to work in, so be it litigation like me, or legislation or policy, just, take whatever opportunities that you can, even if it's outside of animal interest, to develop skills that can transition to the animal world, right? So if the timing's not perfect and you're not getting your dream animal law job right out of law school, but you want to do litigation, join a firm, or join a small boutique law firm, or start your own little litigation shop, to start building those skills, because they're always going to be transferable once the timing is right. And then, also if you're interested in other things besides, animal issues, obviously everything's so connected, right? So you can advance animal interests by advancing other things like workers' rights, and just a broader environmental advocacy, and so you can always go about it from a different way, and that's actually, might be the best approach, because then you're primed to create a new creative avenue that might spur better and more effective changes.
Great, thank you. We have some questions from the audience. First, how do you view the relationship between animal welfare standards and high industry concentration? Are the two incompatible, or do the small number of actors pose an opportunity for widespread adoption?
So I'm not entirely sure I'm following this question.
I think
So
they
animal,
mean, does industry consolidation, does the fact that there's a fewer number of companies due to consolidation mean that it might be easier to move to better humane practices, or does a more diversified, bigger set of more diverse businesses make that more likely? That's how I understand it, at least.
right. I think diversification is more favorable and helpful. While, when you have huge vertically integrated companies that own, 80% of the production practices, sure, if you can get their ear and you can negotiate, them to implement practices that would enhance animal welfare, then of course it's easier for them to just implement that across the board. In reality, I don't think it's likely to happen. And so breaking up that powerhouse of big ag, I think would have more a greater effect on animal welfare, because on the other side of the coin, influencing a smaller actor who's not as powerful, especially politically, to implement practices that are better for the communities that they operate in, I think can be influenced more easily.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question from the audience. Do you think that the ongoing pandemic and its origin in the close confinement of animals will add any weight to yours or similar lawsuits going forward?
I think so. I think it opened up everybody's eyes. The pandemic risks and antibiotic resistant bugs that are created from intensive farming practices have been something that many of us advocates have been ringing the bell around for decades, right? And it was an area that I think a lot of advocates had started to kind of put behind, because it wasn't causing people to change their practices. But now that the threat is so real, and we can see the consequences of global pandemics, we don't want them to occur right again. So I absolutely do think that narrative is going to have impact on many different lawsuits. So, of course, the lawsuit that I brought up that we are bringing against USDA related to bird flu, it's central to, but the lawsuits related to slowing down line speeds at poultry and pig slaughterhouses, it obviously has a storyline there as well. And of course, with all the nuisance cases and anything that has to really do with intensive confinement of animals, I think the current crisis and the threat of future pandemics will be an important narrative to include in those cases.
How can environmental organizations, especially ones that are concentrated in urban areas, make a difference on these topics?
Right. So I'm guessing we mean urban areas, as in there's not many factory farms in those places. Uh, you'd be surprised how in many urban areas there are slaughterhouse or meatpacking facilities. So, in Green Bay, there's a big one. In somewhere, Tennessee, I can't think of the town, but there's, many opportunities to get involved at that stage of the process, especially if your community members are working at those enterprises. And then obviously any activity that you're engaged in to increase equity and equality among those community members, I hope will have repercussions, in communities that aren't urban, right? So I think that's probably the best way those in urban communities could make an impact.
You talked earlier about amicus briefs and the importance when you're considering submitting an amicus brief of thinking about how your organization will be perceived by the district that the court is in. How helpful is it for big greens to be submitting amicus briefs in animal law cases like the ones you've talked about? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful?
It really depends on the case, right? So you'd have to go through that checklist of factors that I kind of identified. It can be helpful, and normally, so the lead attorney on the case is likely to develop an amici strategy and reach out to a groups that they think might play a beneficial role in smaller suits, right, that might have been brought by individual attorneys on behalf of, just people who are litigating for injuries that are caused to them, rather than, strategic litigation brought by like a large organization. That's something that you just have to monitor. And then if you do think that your organization or your perspective is missing from the narrative in that case, and that case could impact the president or the issues that you're working on, you can always reach out to the attorneys who are working on the case to see whether or not they would think that it would be beneficial. Oftentimes, attorneys in those situations just might not have the connections, might not know who to reach out to, even though, it would be really helpful for them to have another voice. So it really just depends. And then as also, as far as kind of integrating, animal issues and environmental issues, I think that's usually important to do. So if there's a big, you don't want to throw in irrelevant factors, right, in your amicus brief. But if there's a big case that's dealing with, Clean Water Act violations, and I don't know, somehow it impacts endangered species as well, and that's not a big, factor in the large case. It might be a way for you to get at other interests that could persuade the court or jury to move over to your side. So I think it's important.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question, which is, what environmental, health, minority, and labor organizations and federal leaders have you found most willing to work with animal welfare organizations to address those overlapping issues?
That's a great question. And goodness, off the top of my head, I just can't think of any. I know there are many. We have great coalition partners And we have coalition partners who work on so many issues. In North Carolina, we have REACH, which is an environmental group that works with the communities that are near these large CAFOs. Public justice often represents workers' interests. Union of Farm Workers Alliance often partner with us. And so it's essential to build up those partnerships. Oftentimes for getting your foot in the door in court too, right? Because oftentimes those interests are able to garner standing, whereas harms to animals provide you no opportunity to get into the court unless you have some kind of special aesthetic interest in those animals or something like that. So there are groups that we work with closely, and I hope there are more and more groups that are willing to collaborate so that we can advance both environmental justice, workers' rights, and animal welfare issues.
Well, that seems like a great place to stop. So we'll wrap up today's talk. Thank you so much, Laura, for your presentation. And great to bring an alum back to VLS to talk about your exciting work. And thank you to everybody who joined us today as viewers. Our next talk in this series will take place on Friday, March 12th at the same time. And we hope that you can join us then. Thanks, everyone.